Welcome to Animal Cognition Lecture 3. Today we're going to be discussing the ethological concept of an instinct, which ethologists refer to as fixed action patterns. And we're going to look at the different components of the fixed action patterns, which include a stimulus and a response component. And we're going to be discussing several examples to illustrate those components. And we're also going to discuss the fact that fixed action patterns can be quite complex. So many people think that instinctive behaviors in animals must be something very, very simple. But this is certainly not the case, right? That even quite complex sequences of behaviors can actually be guided by an instinct. And then towards the end of the class, we're going to be discussing how fixed action patterns can vary with contextual factors like time of day or time of year, point in the development of the animal, and so on. So instincts are very subtle responses. So ethology and instinctive behavior, right? So ethology, which really stressed instincts, emerged in Europe in the 1920s, and it was produced by Nicholas Tinbergen and Konrad Lorenz, two famous ethologists. So following people like Charles Darwin and Romanes and Conway Morgan, different schools of thought emerged in how to study animal behavior, and they emerged in different continents, right? So in Europe, ethology flourished, and it was very different from the kind of approach to animal behavior that emerged in the United States. Right, so we talked about Thorndike last time, and he was an American psychologist. So how does ethology differ from the American approach to animal psychology? Well, in two important ways. First of all, unlike American animal psychology, ethology stresses studying behavior in the wild, while American animal psychology stressed studying animal behavior in the lab. And the reason for that is that, well, in the case of Thorndike, we saw that what he wanted to do was be able to rule out very different interpretations of the same behavior. So only by studying animal behavior in the lab could you set up the tightly controlled conditions that you would need to rule out alternative interpretations. In contrast, ethology focuses studying animal behavior in the wild. And we'll see why this is the case in a minute. But the second difference between ethology and American animal psychology is that ethology also involved studying innate behavior, while American animal psychologists were more interested in studying learning. So why is that? Why these differences between these two approaches? The reason has to do with the fact that ethologists were very much influenced by Charles Darwin and evolutionary theory. And this is because they were biologists by training. Right, so because they were influenced by Darwin and natural selection, they tended to favor instinctive responses. Right, so according to Darwin, natural selection has acted not just on the bodies of animals, but also on their nervous systems. Right, so natural selection has acted on animals to acquire not just certain physical characteristics, but also certain behavior programs that allow them to deal with the recurrent challenges to survival and reproduction that their ancestors encountered in the evolutionary past. Right, so according to Darwin, natural selection has led to certain kinds of instinctive responses. And ethologists get this idea from him. So because of that, if you don't study behavior in the wild, you're going to miss a lot of animal behavior. Right? You're going to get an inaccurate picture of the animal's behavioral repertoire. Why? Because according to Darwin and also according to the ethologists, the environment is what elicits certain innate responses. Right? The environment releases the responses that the animals come wired up with. And these are not going to be seen in the lab. Right? The lab environments where animals are typically studied are very sparse. They're very controlled environments where a lot of the natural stimuli that the animals would encounter are not present, precisely because the animal psychologists want to control every part of the environment as much as possible. Right, so in contrast to that, ethologists say you have to study animal behavior in the wild because it's only in such an environment that you're going to see the full range of the animal's behavior elicited by its environment. So we need to delve more deeply into the concept of an instinct and how it works. And we saw that according to Morgan, before you attribute higher level psychological mechanisms and processes to an animal, you have to rule out that what you're not dealing with is an instinct or some kind of intelligent learning process. Right? So we need to get clear on what an instinctive response looks like. Now, this is important because according to Lawrence and Tinbergen, quite often what looks like a thoughtful, intelligent behavior is actually just an instinct that triggers a very adaptive response. So Lawrence and Tinbergen illustrate this with the example of egg-rolling behavior in the gray-lag goose. So that's what the gray-lag goose looks like. So gray-lag geese rotate their eggs. So when they're sitting on their nests, on their eggs, they rotate these eggs so that the embryo won't get stuck to the shell. Right? But as they're rolling these eggs every day, sometimes an egg will fall out of the nest and roll away, right, by accident. So when that happens, when an egg rolls away, it causes the goose to extend her neck, to rise up and extend her body, and place her bill on the far side of the egg, and then roll it back carefully into the nest. Right, so it looks something like this. They see the egg, they extend their neck, they put their beak on the far side of the egg, and then they roll it back into the nest, and they waddle backwards to do this. So it looks like a thoughtful solution to a problem, right? After all, you don't want to lose an egg. But they say it's actually an instinctive behavior that is triggered by a stimulus. So how do they know that? How do they know that this is some kind of instinctive behavior? Well, understanding that it's going to take a little bit of time, but let's just start by pointing out that Lawrence and Tinbergen found that you could put different objects in front of a goose, and as long as the object had rounded edges, they were willing to roll in a number of different objects into their nest. So what are some of the things that they like to roll into their nest? Light bulbs, batteries, soda cans, oranges, grapefruits, baseballs, and understandably, from my perspective anyway, beer bottles. Right, again, anything with a rounded edge was enough to trigger this kind of response, and that tells you that there isn't a lot of thinking going on in terms of what they're doing. Now, although this looks silly, we got to keep in mind that it is adaptive, because this kind of rolling behavior would normally be triggered by eggs that they've lost, right? So if you look at the environment in which they evolved, this response is actually quite adaptive, because it would be generated typically by the right stimulus. Now, so let's get into more carefully this idea of a fixed action pattern, which is their term for an instinct. So fixed action patterns are innate responses that are triggered by what they call certain sign stimuli. And sign stimuli are a sign stimulus is a collection of independent cues that serve to trigger or release a behavioral response without requiring knowledge or understanding on the part of the animal to perform the action. Right, so a science stimulus is made up of a number of different cues, and these cues are evaluated independently. Right, the animal detects them independently, and when they're present, it serves to trigger this response. So the science stimuli is made up of a set of cues, and these cues are highly perceptually salient to the animal. Right, the presence of these cues in the environment help to capture their attention and direct their attention to a particular part of their perceptual world. So these are things that stand out to them. Now, the science stimuli don't have to have all of the cues. Right? Science stimuli are typically made up of lots of different cues, but not all of these cues have to be present in order for the response to be triggered. Right? But having said that, it's also true that some stimuli, right, some science stimuli, produce a stronger response than others. All right, so each cue, as I said, in the science stimulus is detected and evaluated independently, and the strength of each, right, the strength of each cue is combined to determine the overall likelihood of a response. So if we're talking about egg rolling, what are the cues that are important in the stimulus that serve to trigger this egg rolling response? The cues that seem to be important are the size of the stimulus, the color of the stimulus, its shape, and the degree to which it has this speckling pattern, right, these spots. So how is this discovered? This was discovered by using these gray lag geese, and they put pairs of objects in front of them, and they saw which one they were likelier to roll. Right, so they presented them with pairs of objects that might differ by a single feature. So for example, two eggs that had the same size and color but differed in their speckling, and they would see which one do they prefer to roll in. If it seems to be chance, then it shows that speckling wouldn't be relevant. But if they have a preference to roll in the speckled egg, that shows that speckling is an important part of the science stimulus. Right, so they recorded which object was recovered first. And the potency of a stimulus refers to the likelihood of emitting this response. Okay, so what can we see in this graph? Well, take a look at it. We have here we have different types of stimuli, whether it's a block and spotted, or whether it's a brown egg but unspotted, whether it's realistic but may differ in size, whether it's greener than normal but unspotted, and whether it's greener and spotted. And we have in the center here the normal egg, right? And its potency is set at 1.0, right? So that's the likelihood of retrieving the normal egg. But what you see here is that relative to the egg, some stimuli are much more likely to be rolled in than others. Right? So for example, an object that has the same color and speckle pattern as the normal egg, but is slightly smaller, has a lower potency than the normal egg. Right? It's less likely to be rolled in. And on the opposite end, an egg that has the same color but same speckling but differs in size, right? The larger object is going to have a much greater potency. They're going to be much more likely to roll it in. Okay, so you can see here, you can compare things like an egg that's browner and unspotted with one that has a realistic pattern and is the same size. We can see that the brown and unspotted egg has a lower potency than the normal egg, right? And so on. So what this graph shows you is that some stimuli are much more likely to trigger a certain response, and others are much less likely to trigger the fixed action patterns response. So those stimuli that are much more likely than normal to trigger a response are called super releasers. Right? Stimuli that are likely to be much more likely to trigger a response are called super releasers. Right? And the reason for this is because they exaggerate the cues that the animal is designed to detect. Right? So super releasers are more salient, right? They stand out more in the perceptual world of the animal because they exaggerate the cues that their nervous system was designed to detect. And that's why they're much more likely to elicit the fixed action pattern. So in the case of the egg rolling behavior, eggs that are larger than average tend to elicit stronger responses than the normal egg, as do ones that are greener or have more spots. Right? Those also tend to have super releaser properties. Now the other thing to point out, and this is implicit in what we've already mentioned, is that you don't need natural objects in order to trigger fixed action patterns. Right? You can create a stimulus and it can still be more likely to elicit the fixed action pattern than relative to the normal object that elicits it. So Lawrence and Tinbergen illustrated this with herring gull chicks, right? Little birds. And these herring gull chicks, what they do is they peck at the bill of the parents, right? They peck at a red spot on the bill of the parents, and this causes the parent to regurgitate some food which the chicks then eat. So how do the herring gull chicks decide what to peck at? Right? So what are the sign stimuli that trigger this response? Well, first of all, the stimulus has to have a vertical orientation, so it has to be up and down. Its main orientation has to be up and down instead of horizontal, right? So because the bills tend to point downwards. It also has to be narrow. It also has to move, or although its orientation is vertical, it has to move horizontally, right? So parents move their bills from side to side. Color also seems to be important, right? As I mentioned, the red spot on the side of the bill seems to be what they peck at. And here you can see the chick on the right and the parent on the left. You can see the chick pecking at that red spot on the bill of the parent. Now Tinbergen and Lawrence, they created a super releaser, right? They designed a stimulus, a dowel, that had certain features, and what they found is that the chicks were actually much more likely to peck at that than at a stimulus that looks much more like the parent's own bills, right? The one on the left there. Right, so what they did was they created a super releaser that the chicks tended to prefer compared to something that looks much more like the parents. Alright, so fixed action patterns consist of two things, right? They consist of sign stimuli, which is the stimulus that triggers the response, and then you have the response itself, which ethologists refer to as behavioral units. So behavioral units refer to the sequence of actions as a whole that is carried out to completion upon presentation of the releaser. Right, so it's that full response that's triggered by the sign stimulus. So the thing about behavioral units is that once they're started, they typically cannot be stopped. Right? Even if you take the releasing stimulus or sign stimulus away, the behavior continues. Right? And this is what makes it look kind of silly. But again, this is not something that would typically happen in the wild. So for example, once the egg rolling sequence starts, the egg can be removed and the goose will continue to engage in this response. Right? They'll roll an imaginary egg back to its nest. So when you see that kind of thing happen, that really tells you that what you're dealing with is some kind of instinctive response instead of some kind of intelligent, thoughtful reaction. And we can see that with the case of the European toad, right? They tend to feed on insects and worms. And what happens is at the sight of prey, so if a fly flies by, for example, what happens is that the toad will orient towards the prey. It'll strike at the target with its tongue, right? It'll shoot out its tongue. It'll hopefully catch the fly, and then it'll go into its mouth. Then it'll close its eyes, it'll swallow, and then wipes its mouth with a forepaw. Right? So that full sequence of actions is what happens. Now what's interesting is that the entire sequence is carried out, regardless of whether or not it has caught something. Right? It'll swallow and wipe its mouth even though there is nothing for it to swallow and nothing to be wiped. Okay, so behavioral units. They're carried to completion even if the stimulus is taken away. Now, as I mentioned, just because behaviors are instinctive, it doesn't mean that they are simple. Right? Quite complex behaviors can actually be instinctive. And I want to illustrate this with the Sphex wasp, also known as the Australian digger wasp. What digger wasps do is they build elaborate nests that consist of two parts, a tunnel and a funnel. And let's discuss these two parts. So first, the tunnel is dug 8 centimeters into the ground, and it's 0.8 centimeters wide. And inside this tunnel, the walls are lined with mud, and the wasp's eggs are placed inside each individual chamber. And then the wasp puts some food in there, right? A caterpillar that is going to be food for the larva. Okay, so that's what happens inside the tunnel. But the nest also consists of a funnel, which the wasp uses while it's creating the larva and things like that, and finding food. Right, so the funnel itself has 3 parts. It's made up of a stem, a neck, and a bell. And what it does is it uses this funnel to prevent other wasps, right, wasps of other species, from going inside and putting its own larva inside of the tunnel. Right, so the funnel is a very important part. Right, so this is what the completed structure looks like. You see the tunnel where it's stored caterpillars and where the larva would be placed. And then outside of the ground you have the stem, the neck, and the bell. So what research shows is that although the structure is complex, right, it results from an instinctive program that is carried out in a series of independent stages. Right? There's a set of stages that take place, and each of these stages functions like a computer subroutine. Right? And each subroutine requires that the wasp carry out in an iterative sequence of steps a certain set of activities until the sub-goal is reached. Right? So they got to keep doing the same thing over and over and over again until a goal is accomplished. And then once that goal is accomplished, then they move on to the next subroutine. And they keep doing that until the entire structure is complete. And now I want to discuss how a particular part of this nest is built. And I'm going to focus on the part that is outside the ground, which is the funnel. Right? The entire external structure, which, as I said, consists of the stem, the neck, and the bell. And as I said, it's constructed in a series of stages or subroutines. So the mud stem is constructed so that it's about 3 centimeters long. And it doesn't actually have a little measuring tape where it measures out 3 centimeters. What it turns out to be is that the stem is about 3 body lengths. So it uses its own body size to gauge how long to make the stem. But this seems to be a completely thoughtless process, right? How do we know that? If you add, so as it's building its stem, if you add dirt to the ground around it, right, it's going to keep building more and more stem, right? It's just going to keep going ad nauseum. Now, once it reaches a desired height, right, it goes into the next subroutine. And once it's started building the next part of the structure, you can add dirt and it won't do anything about it. Even if it is important because you want the stem to be a certain distance from the ground. It's not going to care anymore. It's, in its own mind, it's doing the next subroutine, and whatever happened earlier is gone. Right, so it doesn't make any further adjustments. So the next step after it has built the stem is to build the neck. And the neck is the curvature, right? It curves the stem. Right? And it curves the stem until it is about 20 degrees from the horizontal. Right? So the angle that it's looking for, right? The angle of the neck is so that it's 20 degrees relative to the horizon. Right? So the neck is extended in a downward direction until the neck is at a 20-degree angle relative to the horizon. So this is also a thoughtless process, right? If the structure is removed and put into the ground at a different angle, the wasp will keep going, building more and more neck until it creates a full circle, right? So if you pulled out the stem and you put it into the ground at an angle, right, the wasp would keep building the neck until it reached a 20-degree angle relative to the horizon. And once it's completed, once it has finished building the neck, and it goes on to start to build the next part of the structure, you could alter the angle and the wasp won't care. Right? So again, suggesting that it's a thoughtless process. Right, so the third subroutine is the building of the bell. Right, so the bell opens up to it opens up to a diameter of about 2 centimeters and is also about 2 centimeters deep. And again, this is based on its own body length, so 2 body lengths. And the inside is polished smooth so that parasites can't enter. And they know when it's time to stop extending the bell when it's the maximum that they can reach from the bottom to the top of the bell. Right, so they can extend their legs from top to bottom, the top legs and the bottom legs or the back legs. They can extend it about 2 centimeters, so about 2 body lengths. And when they can do that, that's when they know to stop. And the reason for that is because the other parasites wouldn't be able to make that reach, so they wouldn't be able to go into the rest of the structure. Right, so they polish it up. They polish up the bell very, very smoothly so that the parasites can't enter, and they know when to stop extending the bell when they can just barely reach the top from the bottom. And once they have built this bell, what they do is they go into it, they stock it with their eggs, and the caterpillars, they seal each chamber, and then they destroy the funnel. Right? The funnel is gone. So again, this seems to be a purely instinctive process that's carried out in a series of stages. And the wasp doesn't seem to have in mind an image of what the final product is supposed to look like, or why it is doing what it is doing. Right? So that if the animal was engaging or using Morgan's higher level stages of reason or even trial and error learning, you would expect it to behave very differently. Right? But it doesn't seem to have in mind an image of what it's supposed to look like or why it's doing what it's doing. So for example, we saw that adding dirt to the stem will cause it to keep adding dirt. but only during its construction. Once it started building the neck, you could add dirt and the wasp isn't going to do anything about it, right? And that makes it ineffective, right? Because what it should do as it's building the neck, if you add dirt, what it should do is it should stop and it should add more stem and then start rebuilding the neck, right? That would make it effective, but it doesn't do that. Okay, so this is an example of that. So if the wasp had been making the neck and you add dirt as shown in the middle figure, and what the wasp does is it's finished, in its mind it's finished with that subroutine, it's finished with the neck, it is now time to build the bell. Right, so what it does, what it produces is a completely ineffective funnel. Another thing that tells us that what we're dealing with is a mindless instinct is the fact that it doesn't make simple repairs when a hole is drilled. Right, so if you approach one of these nests, and I don't encourage you to do this ever, I've been stung by wasps, so I know how painful that can be. But if you drill a hole in the neck, a simple solution would be for the wasp to simply fill that hole. Right? It can do so. Technically, it could do so. Instead, what it does is it builds an entire new structure, starting from that hole, which obviously is not the most effective or efficient use of its resources. Alright, so to summarize, what looks like a complex behavior can sometimes result from relatively thoughtless processes. And the way that we discover that is by seeing what happens when you interrupt the behavior. You see how the animal responds. Does it respond in a flexible manner? Can it make reasonable adjustments? Or does it seem to be relying on innate instinctive subroutines? Right, so that's how you can figure out what's going on, whether it's some kind of behavioral unit as part of a fixed action pattern, or whether it's using some kind of higher level intellectual